Keynote speech. Dame Vivian is a senior partner at McKinsey and was previously managing partner of McKinsey UK and Ireland for 7 years. She's been voted as one of the top 25 consultants globally. She's also chair of Teach First and, amongst other roles, board member of the British Museum, the South Bank Centre and the CBI. And as we heard from John Allen at the top of the day, part of the UK COVID Recovery Fund. In recognition of her huge contribution to the UK, she was awarded a CBE in 2018. She has helped shape the debate globally on some of the most challenging issues we face, solving the UK's productivity puzzle, and for many years around the how and why of diversity. More recently, in a widely read article and viewed TED Talk, The Case for Stakeholder Capitalism. We should, in her words, hit reset and serve all stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, Dame Vivian Hunt.
David, thank you very much, and to all of the team at Imperial for that really kind introduction. It's a privilege to be with you today. Imperial, I believe, is the right place for this type of conference. Since 1845, when your first institution, the Royal College of Chemistry, was founded, Imperial has had both a practical and social purpose: to foster the best of science and technology and to bring its benefits to work, to put them to work for society, from theory, if you will, into practice. And business, when it's at its best, does the same thing. But I do have a quibble. The wording on the introduction for today's conference says that it's all about responsible leadership in the age of COVID-19 as we shift towards a new era of business. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure that the concept of responsible business is really all that new. Consider New Lanark, a Scottish town in 1796 whose textile works were the opposite of the dark satanic mills that Friedrich Engels describes often too accurately. New Lanark provided decent housing, schools, fair wages, and it thrived. Its then owner, Robert Owen, proved that it was not necessary to mistreat workers to be profitable. But let's also remember what happened next. In 1825, Owen sold up. He left Scotland and, brimming with new ideas and ambition, brought his business plans to America. He went to New Harmony, Indiana, but the settlement that he helped to found failed in just 2 years. There are many reasons that New Harmony failed. According to Owens himself, it attracted too many crackpots and con men and not enough real workers. But one major reason for its failure was that society, the one that Owens imagined, communal, equal, self-supporting, in fact, could not support itself. It didn't have a business model. Owen was out over $200,000, the equivalent of over $5 million today. Almost 200 years later, the principle that doomed New Harmony, Indiana, still holds true. Responsible business leadership has to be anchored in economic success. As I wrote in a recent article for McKinsey, the term of enlightened company, who might have the most perfect intentions but does not make money, is defunct. Or we could just call it New Harmony. Fortunately, I don't think there is a disconnect between those goals, between a profitable enterprise that makes money and responsible social actors. Rather, just the opposite. Stakeholder capitalism, meaning that businesses who seek to serve employees, customers, suppliers, the environment, as well as its investors, is a good term to express this. The evidence is accumulating that stakeholder capitalism can be good for the bottom line. 2 pieces of data to support the idea. First, a McKinsey study of 615 public companies over 15 years found that those with a long-term outlook, something that's fundamental for stakeholder capitalism, outperformed their peers in earnings, revenue, investment, and job growth. In 2020, funds with an environmental, social, and governance focus outperformed the S&P 500, surely an indicator of the resiliency that is so critical to success. These results are not outliers. A study last July of European ESG funds found that on the whole, they had outperformed non-ESG funds over 1, 5, and 10-year timeframes. One of my favorite examples of stakeholder capitalism comes from Costco, a huge US retailer. Its founder and CEO, Jem Senegal, was always under a lot of pressure. He was getting a lot of flack from his investors in 2004 because he chose to pay his frontline workers above the industry average. His critics say that it hurt earnings very directly. The headline from the Wall Street Journal was clear: Costco's dilemma, be kind to your workers or Wall Street. Since then, Costco's is up more than 850%, more than 3 times the S&P average. The same is true for Britain's Unilever, which has embraced holistic stakeholder capitalism over time. If you look at the past 5, 10, or 20 years, it has easily outperformed the FTSE 100, and I could give you many more examples. The COVID era has also provided considerable anecdotal evidence that the value of stakeholder capitalism works. When supply chains were broken, who do you think got the call first when they needed to be restored? The ones with strong relationships. Manufacturers that did not lay off employees as a first resort have picked up market share as economic activity has picked up. The case for stakeholder capitalism is simple. It's a good thing in and of itself to think of more than financial returns, although these are essential. But if done well, it can build a competitive advantage. If you accept that premise, and I know that not everyone does, how do you bring it to life? It starts with leadership. I don't think that good companies need to have any fear of the idea of stakeholder capitalism. In many ways, that's what they already do, and what bad companies choose not to do, I suppose. But I think there's a benefit to stating it, being explicit, that it is a core element of your company's strategy and choices. Ideally, you'd see that in your corporate governance documents, like the annual report. Not every jurisdiction allows this, but it's certainly possible through your words and actions to make your intentions clear. In an era of flux, which is just about all the time, leadership teams have to adapt to change. It sounds painfully obvious, but let's face it, stating that you want to embrace change, say by innovating faster and appointing a new role or signing an anti-racism statement, and actually making those changes are 2 very different things. COVID has brought about more change to the global workplace than almost any event in my lifetime. How many of us were really ready for it? Those that did best, or at least reasonably well, were those who had a strong sense of purpose aligned with digital capabilities. The digital transformation that we've been hearing about throughout today is not around the corner, it is here. The challenge is to harness these capabilities constructively. For example, the rise and extension of remote working practices offers enormous potential to diversify the workforce, part-time roles, often women, underrepresented groups who may not live near the office, or disabled employees, just to name a few examples. Powerful ethical use of AI and big data in the form of sentiment analysis can also be enormously helpful to understand what your employees and other stakeholders are really feeling and thinking. Haidilao, a Chinese restaurant chain, uses live sentiment and insight data, and it acts on it. The result is much higher employee satisfaction and, for example, staff turnover that's 1/4 of the industry average. What gets measured gets managed. That's always been true of financial metrics. And the same is true for social and environmental indicators. Knowing your emissions, for example, is a place to start if you want to manage them. Ditto for things like water use, land use, traffic flows. On environment, the evidence is pretty emphatic. There are many, many ways to reduce your environmental footprint that also deliver cost savings, energy efficiency, lower packaging costs, for example. Methane emissions, which are captured, can be sold, not at a huge premium, but without losing money either. In environmental terms, the value of setting, tracking, publishing specific goals cannot be overstated. And the same applies with the S and the G in the formula. This fosters accountability, something that critics of stakeholder capitalism often point to as a weakness. And it also encourages action. If you really want people to take notice, make progress a component of executive compensation, as 45 of Britain's top 100 companies already do today as it relates to environmental goals. The same can be said for social indicators, those related to employee retention, supplier diversity, and often representation of underrepresented groups such as women or ethnic minorities. McKinsey research found that companies who lead on gender diversity in their executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. Successful companies do many things well, and all of them are more diverse. That's a material difference. And in a competitive world, every edge matters. Again, the social value, employee satisfaction, greater diversity, is consistent with the economic one, correlations with higher profitability. Let's look at Severn Trent, a water and waste company based in the Midlands. Last year, it was named the top UK public company for female representation. It is also regarded at the top for its environmental practices, getting the highest grade last October from the Environmental Agency. Indeed, since Liv Garfield became CEO in 2014, its returns have been almost double that of the FTSE 100. It's fair to say that the term stakeholder capitalism can be a little mushy. And it's true that some companies can really talk the talk fluently and not take many actions. My point is that rigor, hard-headed management practices, goals, strategy, metrics, that's the language of business and the language of progress. I believe the value of this approach is only going to grow. Something like 80% of the corporate value in the United States is now in the form of intangible assets, goodwill, data, innovation, future insights. In short, the human capacity for ingenuity and creativity applied in a business setting. Ask yourself, what kinds of organizations attract the talent who can do these things? It's going to be the kinds of organizations that have clear purpose and strong cultures. These are the things that are central to organizational health, meaning the ability of a company to define and execute against its strategic goals. So one last data point. The top companies in terms of organizational health deliver 3 times the returns of those that are at the bottom. Imperial is well placed to lead this discussion. Given the scale of today's challenges, big solutions and bold leadership are necessary. Perhaps more than ever before, technology and innovation and courageous leaders, areas in which Imperial excels, are going to be the differentiators between success and failure. This is not true only in business, but also in addressing shared global problems like economic development and climate change. That matters because finally, we have ways that we can build in human dimensions to business logic. Capitalism's more extreme critics see our industry is composed of maybe fat cats, greedy, who'll do anything to crush someone else and get another paycheck. And let's face it, those people do exist. The late unlamented Robert Maxwell was a very successful publishing tycoon, and he also stole 450 million pounds from his own employee pension fund. There are many examples. But sometimes those can be caricatures of business people. I've been in and around the business world for many years, and I've met very, very few people who wake up thinking, how do I pollute more, or how do I hurt my employees? As parents and citizens, we want to leave the world a better place, and we want to lead responsibly. Stakeholder capitalism is a framework to do so. It's new harmony with a brain, a balance sheet, as well as a heart. Thank you. David, I think we have time for a few questions, which I hope your audience is ready for after their short lunch break.
That's right. Well, there's a lot of questions here. So let me start with the big question. The research and examples, you've quoted many of them,
yes,
all point to the fact that the stakeholder approach is more successful, more profitable, and frankly, a better way of living. Why is it that so many companies don't accept that premise or don't act on it?
Well, I think it's hard to define, David. You know, when you say shareholder returns, there's a lot of complexity around what adds to near-term, mid, and long-term value. How do you measure that in operating terms, ROE, ROA, and other metrics? So even just within financial metrics, we all might have different definitions. You know, use your total cash flow and profits generated, or is it after dividends, right? After you've repaid your investors the promised allocation and so forth. You can get a different answer just with one change in a very important metric. So I think it's very hard to commit to something as a business leader if you don't know how you can be accountable for delivering it. And that's where you get that gap between what businesses say and then what they do. But today, and it's really enabled by AI and data, you can get much more criteria-based and evidence-led around what exactly you mean around E, around S, and around G. And secondly, what that means for different stakeholders. None of us would be confused if we said you have different customer groups, right? They have different needs, need states, and you need to use different analyses to understand how to reach peak satisfaction with multiple customer groups around the world. Same with the supply chain. What you run in India or China is very different than how you'd set it up between, say, the UK and the European Union. But that same complexity exists in stakeholders. And so meeting the goals first with a strong business that is financially successful, and next that has the clarity and courage to build in those goals. So my sense is that leaders should be confident around that. But I think not knowing how to define it and how to measure it has held even the most well-intentioned of leaders, you know, has caused them to pause sometimes before committing to stakeholder capitalism.
Thank you. That's what we like to hear, that in part it's an educational question. You know, you mentioned most people don't wake up and want to do not good things. There are very, very few. Could you speak to some of the concrete, you know, challenges, you know, well-intentioned firms have had, whether they are consultancies or pharmaceutical companies, because clearly it's been a rocky road in parts?
Well, I think clearly there's hard work to do to understand who your stakeholders are and stay aligned with them. And that's a changing landscape. I think when you look at some of the technology companies today, I think they were really clear about different regulatory and operating environments, but did a company, which remember separated from PayPal 5 years ago, and then now has gone on to become its own financial services platform and enabler in its strategy, particularly for households and small and medium-sized businesses. I don't think the company you see today was even imagined when it was first created. So new expectations, new alignment, all brought into sharp relief by the COVID crisis and our recovery. I say the COVID crisis and recovery because the economic trends and data and case examples that I'm referring to existed well before COVID. It's just the sharp difference we know from companies recovering from recession, as well as so far coming out of the recovery. When you look particularly at Asia, which is a little bit ahead of where we are in Europe and the US, you know, companies that have these longer term characteristics and are able to meet multiple stakeholder needs do a little bit better. But the playing field changes, and that's why being in touch with your stakeholders over time is true. Even in advisory work, in our own case, McKinsey, pharmaceutical companies who believe we're providing objective, fact-based advice, or pharmaceutical companies, long-term capital bets to discover medicine that save lives. I mean, that's a pretty noble purpose, but you got to think about pricing, commercial channels, transparency, data privacy, right? These are all things that 25 years ago were not as much at the fore, or the data sets around them weren't as robust or accessible. So the context is changing on a digital platform, and we've got to be more agile and more responsive. And we've certainly learned that lesson as both a firm as well as many other businesses.
Okay, thank you. So I love the fact that you started your comments with sort of almost a definitional challenge, which is terrific. And indeed, our conference today is about responsible leadership, but very few people sign up for irresponsible leadership. So I wonder, for people who are watching now and in the future, what are some of the key or newer leadership capabilities that you're seeing that people need to be developing?
Well, and I'm focusing on leaders and leadership teams here because, you know, they do the hiring, they decide the resource allocation, they have the media glare. Sometimes they also have the rewards, hopefully in their satisfaction and impact on the world, but also financial rewards. So, you know, with high responsibility comes high accountability. and transparency as well. And it's not asking anyone to feel sorry for business people, but I am saying that if you really think of yourself as leading from the front, the first thing is to articulate your goals in broader terms than just financial outcomes, and then put evidence behind that. So stating, if you take Larry Fink's letter last January 2020, just before the globalization of the real pandemic impacts, it was around committing to ESG. And I think what you see, just them as an example and as a company, but also the reach they have with over $1 trillion, I think, in assets under management and really precedent setting and standard setting within their industry. You see, one, they as a company trying to make hires and build up capabilities that demonstrate that they're taking their own medicine and trying to lead. You see them asking that around their boards and investments sides. And third, hopefully contributing to the debate on conferences and fora like this about how can you actually apprentice leaders when they train, or also, as you'll know from your role in executive education, retrain leaders. You know, the majority of the people who will be in the workforce in 2030 are actually already working today. Some are 18, some are 58, but they're working today. And so retraining and adding these things in. So clarity to add it to your strategic goals, then operationally linking it to your strategy, and then focusing consistently on execution. And if you take companies like a Costco or a Unilever or PayPal, you know, or UPS, I could name many, many examples, Haidilao, they didn't start trying to serve everyone. They really normally started with trying to really serve their supply chain or really trying to serve employees. And from that, it's like a muscle. They develop the capability to serve an even broader set of stakeholders. But the first leadership attribute is the courage to say we're trying to both build an economically successful company and one that serves these other constituent groups. And we're going to put 2, 3, 4 years of effort in a sustained way against that.
Okay, thank you. So we've spoken quite a lot about leadership at the top of the house and quite a lot of senior executives at this conference. But you're also very, very closely involved with Shares Teach First. McKinsey hires hundreds of some of the best graduates. So what do we need to do differently so that we're building a pipeline of future leaders that can act and behave differently? Is there anything we need to do differently as employers?
Well, I think there's probably 3 inflection points, and that's why education, whether it be at the undergraduate or graduate school level, continuing education as executives is so important. But we all know that it's most transformative the earlier you decide to give any person access to a quality education. And so, you know, you mentioned Teach First and the many other organizations that work in primary and secondary schooling. It's about unlocking the confidence and aperture of a good mind, no matter particularly what socioeconomic or other historical barriers to access they may face. And then secondly, continuing that as you go into either the world of work or higher education. So education, whenever you have it, and earlier always better, has a really transformative effect, has like an exponentially transformative effect on our ability to build good leaders and have the capability and skills, because you need agility, as we've learned during the course of this last year. Secondly, I would say we have to train leaders differently, and that's why the business schools are such an important inflection point. It's where you go when you are deciding to, if you will, commit to a career in business and enterprise. We see many joint degrees now, people who have a medical background and a business background, as your panel earlier today showed, and have that combination. In some ways, you want everyone to have enough business training to apply their more specialized technology or health or other skills in a specialized way. And so that responsibility that business schools have to those who are starting out careers in business in the earlier parts of their career, or who want to make a change or expand their skill set, I think is another really important inflection point. And then last but not least, David, I would say it's reskilling. You know, if you look at our work on the impact of technology on jobs, if you sort of say, if we weren't worrying about COVID recovery, what would we be worrying about? Climate change, equitable economic development, and how to achieve that given the transforming nature of work. Those things would still be happening independent. And so regardless of the extra pressure and fragility COVID's added to the economy and the uneven recovery experiences industries and countries will have, you have to reskill. It's as simple as that. And that is probably as urgent a priority as getting it right with younger people. So we have to prioritize, David. No business has unlimited resources. No person has unlimited time or talents. And so you've got to focus on the areas that are going to make the biggest difference. And education early for young people, particularly around STEM technical areas, which they can apply in a wide range of fields. And also really concentrating on business leaders and making sure they're aware of how to lead businesses that serve all stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps a couple of questions coming through, and perhaps
we're only taking easy questions, David. I missed part of John's Q&A, so you make sure you don't give me any questions that are harder than his.
Okay, so we'll see if we can. Actually, poor fellow broke his hip, so he had the luxury of being recorded. So he dodged the questions.
No, bring it on.
Well, let me ask a slightly more personal question then.
Mm.
So, you've led a lot from whether it was a few years ago to Peace Corps in Senegal to a pretty large organization, McKinsey UK, and with global responsibilities. And there have been always challenges organizationally.
Mm.
What have been the most difficult elements for you in terms of either being a stakeholder-led leader or leading an organization to lead a sustainable stakeholder-oriented organization?
David, I'm a big believer that you have to see positive examples of change to have the confidence to make the change. That's why case examples and evidence base are so important in the work that we do at McKinsey. But at the end of the day, any person or a leadership team has to make up their own mind about what strategic goals they want to pursue and how they're going to go after them. And so, it is one thing to be able to set that frame and provide the evidence. But any person on a team or on a leadership team of a client, has to make the decision for themselves, for their stakeholders. And so hopefully you set a frame where leaders can make that decision so that it's a shared goal. It doesn't feel risky. It doesn't feel like it's a trade-off of economic returns versus something else, that you have a holistic perspective, even when there are trade-offs or there are bumps in the road. Many companies have faced huge shocks in the last 18 months and or challenges in their history, but their recovery muscle and resiliency, which is one of the attributes of companies that have broader strategic objectives over the mid and long term and are more oriented towards stakeholders, including investors, perform better. They're more resilient. And so it helps you in good times and bad. So I think you've got to make the decision for yourself, but you want to make a system change. So my hope, David, is not just to be an individual example or an exception to the rule. It's to help create systems and systemic approaches to incorporating ESG into mainstream business objectives, incorporating systematic evidence-based approaches to stakeholder capitalism that demystify it and make it feel less complex. And that's happening very quickly with E. And I think the same thing should happen with S and G. So I want to lead by example, David, which I think you're rightly implying. But my individual example, your individual example is positive, but it's an anecdote. What we want is data. We want a system that actually can support these changes over time. And that's really what we're working towards at McKinsey and beyond.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got time, I think, for one. And fortunately, it's a big question, but a short answer because we're short of time on this. People are really interested in McKinsey. I mean, it's kind of secretive. It's humongously influential, and perhaps not secretive, but just people don't know how it works. And in many ways, it's led the way in many areas of business. Mm. What do you think is the biggest challenge for McKinsey in these next few years?
Well, we have two or three things that inform our points of view. One, obviously, is of course our client work and the diversity of clients we serve globally. And you just have to look at some of the geopolitical tensions in the world to know that context really matters, and that both private as well as public sector clients need and want different things depending on where they are in the world and where they are in their business challenge, and we try to learn from the full breadth of our experience, and reconciling those things and finding the right insights, what's common, what's unique, and while maintaining confidentiality. Second, we learn a ton from our people, David. You know, we have some assets, but we're mostly an ideas and capability, and the trust we have with colleagues, and making sure that particularly our younger colleagues, but all colleagues, feel that we are taking our own medicine and trying to be the best firm we can be for their learning and development, and therefore serving our clients. And we have to pass that test every year in recruiting, development, and feedback culture, which, you know, feedback's not always easy, David. I don't know if you have 360 feedback as part of Imperial's process, but it's tough sometimes. But that's what we need to do as leaders within our own company before we can give that advice to our clients. And then the final thing is that we've strengthened some of our policies and practices. It's not super sexy, but it is a really foundational to ensure that we've got equitable policies and practices, and we're robust in terms of professional standards and risk management and saying who we are and stating our values. And so that's how we've responded to it. You know, innovative client work, learning lessons from all different contexts in a world that is going to be more complex, I think, in the next century than it has even in the last. Listening to our people and trying to be consistent and hope to be the firm that they want to join. And then third, backing that up, all that good intention and promise up with really good policies and practices. We make mistakes, no question, we stumble sometimes, and we don't intend to be mysterious. We are trying to be more transparent and aligned than ever, but we are learning as we go, and like any organization, we're doing our best.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for lifting the lid a little bit. And thank you for your, we have to call it time there. So thank you for your hugely open and thoughtful comments and replies. Some people may have seen McKinsey as the high temple of capitalism, red in tooth and claw. I don't think that's the case. In contrast, my lasting impression, and indeed, I think, if I may, your challenge to all of us is to create a new harmony with, I think your phrase was, a heart, a brain, and a balance sheet. So Vivian Hunt, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
David, I think that we should have a prize for the Imperial student that can draw the line between Robert Owen and his community in New Lanark, and of course the McKinseys of Gamma, Missouri, in the late 19th century. I'm sure there's some family connection there. Among the values and principles, of course, of the firm that were defined by one of their first partners, Marvin Bauer, was the idea of telling the truth, even if it means challenging the client's opinion. And we really appreciate Dame Vivian joining us to make